we talk about the exodus from Egypt. Finally, after hearing about the slavery in Egypt and hearing about the suffering, and after the plagues and Moshe warning Pharaoh, and Pharaoh doesn't listen, and the plagues and more plagues, the Jewish people finally are ready for the exodus from Egypt, and that comes this week. And we couldn't begin this without the story of how little boy David, or call him as you wish, shows up home from school after his first Sunday in the Hebrew school. And his mom says, so what did you learn? What did you discover about being Jewish? He says, well, we talked about the exodus from Egypt. Wow, so what happened? As you know, Pharaoh didn't want to let the Jews go until Moshe finally forced him, and they went free. And then Moshe pulled off some stunts, and the Jewish people got out. And finally, the Jews left Egypt, but the Egyptians were chasing them. When they came to the Red Sea, Moses suddenly got the engineers to put up a pontoon bridge, and they crossed the sea. And then the reinforcements came in and blew it up just in time to, and he's going on and on. And mom was like, are you sure that's what your teacher said? So, well, actually not. But if I would tell you what she said, you would never believe it. But of course, this is the story that we do believe, the story of the Exodus. The Jewish people were taken out of Egypt, finally, with all the drama and those miracles. And we always hope and pray, as we've been talking in the past few classes, for that day to come again, for us to be taken out in the current exile with its challenges to the coming of Moshiach and back to Jerusalem in its proper way. So let's look and see what actually happened and how we react to it. We start with this one page over here, reading from this week's portion. It came to pass at midnight, and the Lord smote every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who is in the dungeon, every firstborn animal. And Pharaoh arose at night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great outcry in Egypt, for there was no house in which no one was dead. In every single house, the firstborn, or as the commentaries tell us, the oldest person in the house, was gone. So the entire country is all of a sudden in shock and mourning. So he, which is Pharaoh, called for Moses and Aaron at night, and he said, get up and get out from among my people, both you, as well as the children of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have spoken. In other words, do it on your terms, because to that point they had been negotiating, and every time Pharaoh was willing to let them go, but not the children, not the cattle, and they refused to settle. Now he says, you go on your terms, take also your flocks and also your cattle, as you have spoken, but go, and you shall also bless me. So the Egyptians took hold of the people to hasten and send them out of the land, for they said, we are all dead. The people picked up their dough when it was not yet leavened, the leftovers bound in their garments on their shoulders. So they went and really ran out of Egypt with their unbaked bread, as we know, the matzah, and they're out to the desert. And the children of Israel did according to Moses' order, and they borrowed from the Egyptians silver objects, golden objects, and garments. The Lord gave the people favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they lent them, they emptied out Egypt. This is another part of the story. God had promised Abraham they would leave rich, and they did leave rich. The children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkos, about 600,000 on foot, the men besides the young children, so 600,000 households, because one man per household counted, but to include the rest of the family, you're 2+ million people probably. And also a great mixed multitude went up with them in other people, Egyptians, who joined them, and flocks and cattle, very much livestock. They baked the dough that they had taken out of Egypt as unleavened cakes, for it had not leavened, for they were driven out of Egypt and they could not tarry. And also they had not made provisions for themselves, so they ate matzah.
Was there a lot of Egyptians or non-Jews that came with them?
There was an Erev Rav, we said this mixed multitude, that means non-Jews who joined along and converted, But some of them were not so sincere, and they were trouble later on, as we know.
But do you know approximately the amount?
The number we don't know. But it's Erev Rav means that it was large. So it was not just a few people. It came to pass at the end of 430 years. Sorry, in the habitation of the children of Israel, they dwelled in Egypt was 430 years. It came to pass at the end of 430 years, and it came to pass in that very day that all the legions of the Lord went out of the land of Egypt. It is a night of anticipation for the Lord to take them out of the land of Egypt. This night is the Lord's guarding all the children of Israel throughout their generations. So that's the story. Jewish people left Egypt with all the drama and forced the Egyptians to let us go. And of course, we became free people. And following that and the crossing of the sea, received the Torah at Mount Sinai. And the rest, as we say, is history. But this story of leaving Egypt, we don't just treat as a story. We never stop talking about it. What's this? What do you see on the screen? And I'll bring it up here for our online viewers. That's the Seder, exactly. So you see the Seder. What happens at the Seder? What are we talking about at the Seder? Of course, we're celebrating in grand style with matzah and this 4 cups of wine and the dinner and all the traditions. The exodus from Egypt. 3,300, almost 33 years later. Same story, same night, same party. We don't let go. But that's once a year. It's not only once a year. That's the famous one. We talk about the exodus from Egypt and the big party once a year. Let's go on to the next page. What's this? Attention, gentlemen, the blessing for the wine. This is part of the Kiddush we read on Friday night. I'm using this as an example. Blessed are you, Lord. He goes through to praise God, thank God for the Shabbat, the first of the holy festivals commemorating the exodus from Egypt. So what's this Shabbat about? It reminds us of the exodus of Egypt. So not only every year, every week. You can go further than that. If you have the Siddur next to you, I think it's on page 86. There's 6 things we remember every day. Every day we read it after the Shacharit, after the morning prayer. 6 remembrances. The first of them is the exodus from Egypt. Every single day, we remember the exodus from Egypt. So every year, every week, every day, and if you go through the Torah in many, many mitzvahs, the Torah keeps saying, I am the God who took you out of Egypt, so don't charge interest. I am the God who took you out of Egypt. Wear tzitzit. I am the God who took you out of Egypt. Do this. I am the God who took you out of Egypt. Don't do that. This is the entire Judaism constantly obsessing, should we say, with the exodus of Egypt. Why? Any ideas?
Was appearance of God.
Okay, and therefore, let's elaborate.
I mean, that's where actually the God revealed himself. I mean, that was the first opportunity for people to see God. So I guess.
Okay, this is a very important point. The exodus of Egypt is the time that we saw God's hand in this world openly. So most of the time, we believe in God. We don't actually meet God. In Egypt, they were able to see God in action. And it's that faith that we believe that the same God who did all that is still running our world. And this lies at the foundation of the Jewish faith. This is true. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to constantly remember the exodus from Egypt. Any other ideas? Lots of thought. That's okay. So the exodus from Egypt keeps coming up in every area of Jewish practice, and it really lies at its foundation. In fact, we say the Jewish people became a nation at that moment. That's what makes us who we are. Essentially, till then, we were just a large family, descendants of Jacob. God took us out of Egypt, separated us from them, and we became identified as the Jewish people. Our history really begins there. Before that, it's the family that we descend from.
Well, but this also reminds us that we need to take ourselves out of our own Egypt.
So that is correct, and that's part of what we want to talk about, what it means for us to go out of Egypt and why we constantly discuss. But what you have here is a piece of the reading of when God appeared, the only time that it was even more than the Exodus of Egypt, and that's at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. What happens when the Torah is given at Mount Sinai? God introduces himself. And God says, this is how the Ten Commandments begin. God spoke all these words to respond. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall not have the gods of others in my presence. You shall not make yourself, and it goes on to say. So what's God's introduction? God shows up for the first time, essentially, and he says, it's me. I'm God who took you out of Egypt. This introduction bother anybody? Is there something strange about this introduction?
Yeah, before that it never happened. It's always not appearance, but communication from God to the Jews. It was always happened through the prophecies.
Okay.
This time that is for all Jews.
But why? Okay, so this is correct. This is the first time, and essentially the only time that all the Jews stood together and heard the word of God. But why does God introduce himself as the one who took us out of Egypt? Or maybe that's a good idea. Does anyone have another suggestion how God should introduce himself? Well,
he elevated us from the lowest point, from the lowest place on earth. So.
Did you ever visit, I don't know, some billionaire? He built himself a fairy tale mansion with all kinds of stuff going on, and you come inside and he says, this table, it's mine. My table. Of course, your table, but it's the house. Forget about the table. That's what it sounds like God is doing in this case. I took you out of Egypt. He created this world.
I mean,
It's all puppets for him. The whole world is his. Why doesn't he say, it's me, I created the universe? You were going to say something.
No, I'm saying, I mean, he was the one who put us there, and he, the one who took us out from the Egypt, so he pretty much showing that he's in control of our lives.
Okay, that's correct. But the question that's asked in the Chassidus is, we can find many reasons and not much importance to God taking us out of Egypt. But if God is going to appear one and only time, if you have one chance for a job interview, one chance, one presentation for your political campaign, whatever it is, you give it your best shot. God is going to appear one and only time. This is the only chance we have to see him. And he doesn't introduce himself as the creator of the universe. Instead, he says, we went out of Egypt, that was me. They say, it's a little bit of maybe not the best joke at this current political environment, but they say that there was finally a Jewish boy, his mom always wanted him to be a doctor, but he was into other things. He went into political science, got involved. Years, decades went by. He finally becomes the first Jewish president of the United States. So he's elected, and it's time for inauguration. And he calls his mom. He says, Mom, I won the election. She says, okay, very nice. And I want you to come to the inauguration. No, I'm busy. Don't worry, you have to make time. I don't know how to get there. I'll send you a limo. And finally, okay. I think I'll work it out. But tell me, your brother, the doctor, surgeon, is he going to be there? Yeah, he's going to be there too. The whole family is coming. She says, okay, I'm coming. She comes. They give her a seat of honor next to the justices of Supreme Court, somebody else, and the proceedings start. And he comes up to take an oath of office, and she whispers to the judge sitting next to her, says, you see that boy? The one with his hand, he's making the oath. His brother is a doctor. So God comes and he says, I took you out of Egypt, but isn't God much greater and beyond all of that? Why should that be his introduction? There's many explanations we could give. Alex mentioned that this is in itself is important. This is important to us. Personally, he helped us. He took us out of our suffering. It shows how God is involved in our life. And that is correct. One of the reasons we always talk about the Exodus from Egypt is kind of like we talked last week, because people know there is a God, but they forget or they don't appreciate and understand that God is active in our world. And the Exodus from Egypt shows God active in the details of life in this world. But nonetheless, on a broader scale, we can ask the question, why does God introduce himself in a limited fashion instead of going on the full picture? So, interestingly, the Rebbe asked this question in what turned out to be the last Ma'amar, the last Hasidic discourse that the Rebbe gave. In other words, the Rebbe, it's actually a few weeks from now, the Rebbe had a stroke when he was just short of 90 years old in 1992. And that's when he stopped, being able to publicly speak. He became paralyzed part of his body. He wasn't really able to speak. But the discourses, the Hasidic discourse, we call a Maimer, which is more of a kind of new idea in Hasidic teaching that a Rebbe would be teaching for the first time. And it's really a symbol of an actual Rebbe to teach that kind of discourse. The Rebbe taught that for the last time in its full fashion in 1989. So in that discourse, it was right before Shavuot, the Rebbe asks this question and amplifies it, improves it for pages. Why does God introduce himself as the one who took us out of Egypt and not the one who created the world? In a nutshell, the Rebbe answers this question, drawing back on the understanding that we have that the creation of the world is really no big deal for God. And of course, the Exodus from Egypt is really no big deal for God. But there's a big difference between the two. The creation of this world is God, the infinite God, restricting himself to create a finite world. Really, what's created from God should have been infinite like God himself. Instead, our world is finite, structured, everything has its endpoint, expiration date, and limitations. God specifically did this, obviously, for the objectives of how this world should be the way we know it. But that took self-limitation for God to create a limited and restricted world with a natural life and the challenges and limitations that has. The Exodus from Egypt is essentially the opposite. The Exodus from Egypt teaches us something that people didn't always believe. Until today, we might believe, but not truly internalize and really feel it when it's relevant to us in our lives. And that is that it's possible to break free. Even if you're within a certain limitation, you can be freed from that limitation. You don't have to always be there. What happens tomorrow doesn't have to be what happened yesterday. The Jewish people were slaves in Egypt. There is no freedom fighters. There is no human rights organizations, whether they help or not. No Red Cross, no UN, whether they help or not. There's no hope in that point of history. If you're a slave, you're going to be a slave until you die, and then the grandchildren too. That was the way the world was. So maybe the Egyptian empire would collapse at some point, but in their horizon, there was no possibility for freedom. Comes God and says, no, you're going to be free. We're going to break this open and you're going to be free. Creating a new reality that we can change from being a slave, from being in a challenge, from being limited, from being in the place where you don't want to be, to actually being free. So this is, of course, a core and central idea for the Jewish people as a people. The hope and the realization that we're not defined by what happens right now. We're not defined by a challenge, even a great one, even as terrible as it was then. We remain free people, and we can always break free from the limitation that's around us. That means two things. That means from the point of the exodus from Egypt, we were able to be free. There's potential to break free, just as we broke free then, to break free from other circumstances that develop. And in that case, we're free all along. If you're not stuck here and with no hope to get out, if you hold on to that hope to be free and you look for that opportunity, you're really already free. Your heart is free, your mind is free, your arms might be cuffed. Okay, that's a challenge to overcome. It's just like a red light. You got to get through it. But you're not actually the actual slave. The actual slave is the one who doesn't understand that he could be free. The one who accepts it. The one who gives up and says, this is the place where I stay. From the moment God took us out of Egypt, we become those free people that are essentially free. We always know that we can be freed, and therefore, even if we're technically locked up, we don't it doesn't actually define us. They say, and I'm not able to promise if it's true or not, but they say that Sharansky said that he managed, through his imprisonment in the Soviet Union, through humor. And in one particular situation, he was being interrogated, I think it was typically at night, the way the interrogations would go, by two KGB officers, and they're giving him a rough time. And he finally somehow decides to say a joke. And he says, I don't remember who was boss at that time, but I believe it was maybe Andropov, I don't remember. Maybe I'm getting the years wrong. Whoever was secretary of the party at that time, he convened the Politburo and said, the Americans got to the moon first, we're going to the sun. We have to beat them. Americans got to the moon, we go to the sun. This was before vaccines. So, the guys around the table finally somebody gets the courage to say, it's not possible to go to the sun, they're not going to come back. So, you think I didn't think about this? We're going to go at night. Everything's going to be okay. So, of course, he finishes the joke, bursts out laughing, and the two officers are controlling themselves as best as they could not to laugh, because whoever is the first one to laugh, the other guy takes care of him. So who's the free person in the room? Obviously, the Jew is locked up, but the Jew stays free because he chooses to be free. And the officers locking up are the ones who actually live in that limitation. So a Jew, from the time of the exodus of Egypt, always has the potential to break free, and therefore is always free. This is much more important for us than God's creation of the world. Of course, God could create the world. And what else could he do? I don't know. He'll do whatever he likes. But now, the big deal is that God granted us to be free. God granted us that we are never stuck in a situation. We're not stuck in Egypt, and we weren't stuck in Babylonia or under the Greeks or whatever it is, and we're still not stuck today. We still have the potential to rise and grow and move forward to a better and greater place. So the exodus from Egypt is that moment that changes our identity, changes our understanding of who we are. It says, you're not stuck here, you can go out of here. That, of course, is what makes it so central in the Jewish tradition. We keep encountering it at every moment and every time, because Judaism is not about how great God is, that too, but it's more about how close we're going to get, how much we're going to free ourselves from each situation. And here's where it's important, the understanding But as Leo mentioned earlier, that the exodus from Egypt is also a personal one. So we can talk about this in global or national terms. The Jewish people are free and we always have hope, and that's important, maybe the most important. But this is also something personal, because the Talmud teaches us that in every generation, every individual Jew should see himself as having gone out of Egypt. This is why we keep repeating it and we celebrate it. We actually see this as personal. We left Egypt. Now, what does that actually mean? We were never in Egypt to leave. Maybe some of us visited. I did not. What does it mean? We left Egypt. Other people obviously experienced other modern Egypts. Some of us did not. But what does it actually mean that every Jew in every generation, every time, sees himself as leaving Egypt?
We were slaves. We were slaves of something.
Exactly. So the Alter Rebbe discusses this in Tanya, and he actually first clarifies what the Talmud means. And here we go. In every generation and every day, a person is obliged to regard himself as if he had that day come out of Egypt. The Alter Rebbe says when the Talmud says in every generation, actually means in every day of your life. Throughout your generation, throughout your life, you're constantly seeing yourself as leaving Egypt. And as he goes on to explain, it's a little bit Kabbalistic terms, but this refers to the release of the divine soul from the confinement of the body, the serpent's skin, in order to be absorbed the unity of light of the blessed Ein Sof. In other words, to not be limited by our own personal limitations, but be closer and more connected to the one God. How so? Through occupation in the Torah and commandments in general, and in particular through accepting the kingdom of heaven during recital of the Shema, wherein the person explicitly accepts and draws upon himself his blessed unity when he says, "The Lord is our God, the Lord is one." Now, what does that mean? So, the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya, as we see here, is talking about the individual's daily exodus from Egypt. If you ever notice, in the Shema, we have three sections, three paragraphs of the Shema. The first one, which is where we start saying there's one God who cover our eyes, we read one paragraph, and then there's a longer one. Then there's a third paragraph, which are actually in the daytime we hold the tzitzit when we read that. What's going on there? Well, if you'd like, only the first two are required to read by the Torah. We read the Shema every morning and every evening, because in those two paragraphs, the Torah says, speak these words when you go to sleep and when you awake. So every evening before we go to sleep and every morning when we awake, we read those two paragraphs that contain that instruction. The third paragraph is from a totally different part of the Torah. Doesn't talk about the same topics. It talks about the tzitzit, but it also talks about the exodus from Egypt. And the rabbis added it on with the Shema to fulfill the mitzvah that we mentioned earlier, to constantly mention the exodus from Egypt. So they built it into the prayer to fulfill that mitzvah by reading this passage, although it could have been a different one. But the Alter Rebbe says this is not the whole story. We're not just looking for a place, if you have a daily routine, so you might say, I'm going to keep the keys to my car in a certain spot so I know where they are in the morning. So we'll build the mention of the exodus from Egypt into the Shema so that it has a set place to be. That's nice, but that's not the whole story. We mention the exodus from Egypt at the conclusion of the Shema because the Shema is all about leaving Egypt. Egypt in Hebrew means what we've been talking about, limitation. The word Egypt is not Egypt, but Mitzrayim. Till today, the Israelis call it Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is the same word as the Hebrew words Mitzar or Mitzarim, which means fences, walls, constrictions, limitations. To be in Egypt means to be limited. And we feel limited. We feel that we can't. We feel that we're stuck. We feel that we have a habit that we can't get rid of. We feel that we don't want to or need to or cannot do more or greater or better or closer to God or more selfless, whatever the example is, but we can. And the way we can is by leaving Egypt, which we do when we read the Shema. Every morning and every evening when we say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, we say there's only one God, which in the true definition, as Kabbalah explains, is not only one God and no more gods, but there's only one thing that's God. There's only one true reality, the reality of God. Everything else is flexible. Everything else is temporary, and everything else is changeable. And the more we recognize that the one only true reality is the reality of God, the more we're able to make everything else flexible and break through whatever the limitation will be. The more we connect to that oneness of God and realize that's the true truth, that's the real reality of life, the more we're able to say the rest of it we can deal with and we can overcome. And this is the daily exodus from Egypt. Every generation and every day, a person has to regard themselves as coming out of Egypt because it has to constantly happen. We have to constantly do this inside ourselves. They say the story goes back to the shtetl and the unfortunate time when many Jews were very poor and they're therefore also ignorant. Some of these Jews in some of the very small towns couldn't even read. We've heard some of those stories in the past. But always very sincere, very connected, very committed, trying very hard to be a good person and a good Jew. So the story is told of a father and a son, very simple people, worked the field, and maybe they could read, maybe they can't, but didn't know much about anything deeper than that. And each morning they woke up, they had breakfast, they said their prayers, whatever they did, and they went to work in the fields, a long, hard day of work. Comes one morning, father wakes up the son, and he says, today we're skipping breakfast. I said, what's going on? Well, it's 17th of Tammuz, let's say, which is a fast day on the Jewish calendar because the Babylonians breached Jerusalem, or exactly how that happened. We'll leave the details for another time and the dates, but we fast the 17th of Tammuz because of a number of tragedies that happened that day, including the breaching of Jerusalem. So today we fast, we're Jews, this is part of our tradition, part of our history, and we're going to skip breakfast and go to work. What can I do? Okay, so that's what they do. Comes the next morning, father wakes up the son to start the new day, and the son doesn't want to get out of bed. He's concerned that it's going to be the same thing. Today we skip breakfast because of something else. I had enough of it. No breakfast, no getting up. I'm staying in bed. The father finally says, and this is the punchline, Heint is nicht Nächten in Yiddish. Today is not yesterday. Today you can eat breakfast. Don't worry about it. It's all over. Let's get going. But that's the point. Today is not yesterday. What happened yesterday, doesn't define what happens today. We naturally maybe don't think, but feel that it does. So I tried this 100 times. It doesn't work. Why should I try it again? I know the results. I know I'm stuck in a certain habit or certain maximum I can achieve or certain amount of involvement in Judaism that I'm going to have. Whenever I try to go further than that, I fall flat on my face. I'll stop here. I've learned from experience. They say that there are optimists and optimists with experience, no pessimists. I have experience. I know that it doesn't work. So I'll live with it. But the Jewish teaching and the Torah's message of remembering the Exodus from Egypt tells us no. Today is not yesterday. Today we read the Shema, and the Shema says, your habit, your limitation, your challenge, that's nice, but there's only one God. That's why they say, I don't know who came up with this, don't tell God how big your problems are, tell your problems how big God is. In other words, there's only one God, one truth that really matters. And if you connect to that, you realize that everything else is flexible. And you can, it's not necessarily easy, but you can overcome that challenge, and today doesn't have to be yesterday. So obviously by this point, we understand and hopefully appreciate why we're constantly in the message of the Jewish people leaving Egypt. It comes up in so many mitzvahs, it comes up in so much of what we do, because this is really what we're trying to do. We are trying to leave Egypt, and we're always leaving Egypt and hopefully breaking through another barrier and another glass ceiling, if you will, and another limitation, getting closer to a time when there are finally no limitations, the coming of Mashiach. But I wanted to talk about how this connects to this week, where we are right now. And for that, we're going to need this, but let's share it. There we go. So what's this week? I mean to say, this Shabbat is the 10th of Shvat. 10th of Shvat is the Yortzeit anniversary of passing of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. So the father-in-law of our Rebbe, or the last Rebbe, passed on in 1950, and it was also Shabbat that year, the 10th of Shvat. So it's 71 years ago to be exact. We commemorate that every year, as well as the Rebbe himself beginning his leadership. Now, it's not exactly the same day, but it's a year later, because after the passing of his father-in-law, the Rebbe refused to accept the leadership. And he kept insisting, it's not for me. Until that point, the Rebbe had kept a very low profile, and most people didn't know him. And this was really the Rebbe's personal style. He had always studied in private and stayed away from the center. And now everybody's insisting that he'd be the Rebbe, and for a year, he pushed back at it. And finally, exactly a year later, at the first Yortzeit, he accepted to be the Rebbe. And we're going to watch really the story of how that plays out. But the short of it is that there's a mimer, like we were discussing, on Discourse of Hasidus. So any rabbi who reads the book can teach Torah. And the Rebbe did that too throughout that time that he was insisting that he's not going to be the Rebbe. But what would distinguish somebody as the Rebbe, the leader of the whole movement and of the Jewish people, would be to teach what we call the Ma'amar of Hasidus, the Hasidic discourse, where you're not just putting together teachings of Torah, but this is really sharing a new idea, really a new divine insight in the Kabbalah and in the meaning of the Torah. So until that point in 1951, the Rebbe refused to do so. And finally that night he did, and that meant he was accepting that he's going to do this role and he's going to lead the community. But that mimer, that discourse that he said at that time is very specific, and that's what we want to talk about. Let's first see this bit of history, Chabad history, and really Jewish history.
In 1951, Reb
Or is it here?
Moshe Chaim Sapochninsky.
Let's get the sound straightened up.
In 1950,
Okay, we're going to cheat on it.
It was the son-in-law, right? Rebbe?
Huh?
It was the son-in-law.
Yes. We're going to share it this way, and I hope that the Zoom picks up the sound.
Reb Moshe.
Still not. That should work.
Sapochninsky traveled to New York from Montreal, Canada, in honor of Yud Shvat, the first yard site of Rabbi Yosef Yitzhak, the previous Rebbe. He was present when a group of elders other Hasidim petitioned the Rebbe to accept the leadership of Chabad Lubavitch, which he had previously declined to do.
Der erste Judschweiz war am Mittwoch. Der hat die dann übernommen. Befehlt. Noch dann, der war eingegangen zu sich im Zimmer. Und mit einem Toten werden, das habe ich gar nicht gesehen. Wenn Gurung gesagt habe, die Menschen und so, habe ich überzeugt, ich bin nicht zu gegangen, was ich sage. Ich habe mit dir, ich habe geguckt, zu werden mit dir. Da haben wir doch eigentlich zu die Benech gehabt. Wir fühlen nicht das, was ich immer sage, sie getroffen, der Rebbe, sie setzen mit dem Schneid. Du hast mich schneid. Ich denke, in dem Westen, sie werden zu Katanowski, dazu unterwegs zum Leben, dem Gesamtskasch, oder lieber nennt es. Der Weg, sagt man, der gewinnt. Ich liebe nicht gewinnt, weißt du, was ich liebe, den Stahl, Amor, beim Verbringen, wenn wir mit der Rebbe, mit der so stark nicht daran bin. Das ging nach 5 Minuten, jetzt aber ruhig. Jetzt haben wir genommen das so, das kann ich sehen. Als es schon in den Zelt, bin ich gewusst, als wir sind übernommen erleben, wir sind nach Hause gegangen. Nachher ist nach Hause gekommen, Chadakor, und dann gesagt mir, wo sie gewartet, als 8 Jahr, als nach, mit einer Fabrik, Covid und Schweiz. Und sie gewusst, dass sie sind etwas so, nein, sind wir dann gefahren, noch da, sind wir gefahren zum Neujahr. Karl, der Positive zum Neujahr. Wir sind gefahren zurück von Neujahr, und wir gesehen, der Herr gefordert zum Neujahr. Und so die Karl ist gedreht, und mitgefahren, sagt mir, wie sehen doch, wenn der Herr steht, beim Steven, ja, wir kommen zurück. Wenn der Herr so doch nicht kann, weit nach wie so, die normale Waschen, die Welt, sie noch die Welt und die Gebäude, so dass sie noch offen lassen. Die standen waren doch nicht standen. Wir denken, wir sind nicht weggekommen, gewarnt, bis der Rebbe von weg. Die Karre, was mir gebracht hat, gewarnt, bis der Rebbe wieder weggekommen. Nachher bin ich weggekommen, auch in der gekommen, namentlich 77. Aber dann bin ich gekommen zu Fabriken. Der Rebbe ist da reingekommen. Die verschiedenen Bestände, und steht in der Maschine getan. Der Rebbe ist da weggesetzt, die werden Rebbe sind der Rebbe und so, mit dem Mochaim, mit diesen Gebunden, mit diesen Gebunden. Mit Tamo, Zachabel ist der und von den verschiedenen. Stimmt ja der Haru, stimmt Zachabel. Rebbe, wir bauen hier so dauernd an meiner Chsides. Das ist die Bogen stehen, dort ein paar Minuten, wenn ich stehe, der Rebbe die Duse Meichen an, so bitte der erste Werte gerichtet, so. Die Schrieben, der Rebbe der schwer, in der Meimer, wo sie da ruhig gegeben zu dem Jahrzeit für den Staat, wo sie wieder nach Hause haben, und er hat gesagt, das Stück sein von Jahr, nachher hat er gesagt, dann will ich nicht wieder so. Dass ich denke, was ich will. Sie hat der Rebbe sich gesagt, der Meimer gesehen, und mich in Wusaburg hat sie am Motorrad, der Rebbe Tommy mit dem und das so, bis ich nachher noch einmal gesagt, nachher gewinnt sie wenn sich das der gewinnt die Werte gedeckt. Ich denke, das ist nicht gedeckt, steht der mit und so. Ich glaube, sie den Wegtag stimmt. Feger war im Busen. Da Aussprache gewinnt und so. Ihr darf so nicht. Ihr soll dazu ihr heraussetzen. Ich weiß noch, wie ich kenne zusammen. Aber ihr sollt sagt, noch nicht verlassen von mir im Ganzen. Ihr sollt tun und ihr sollt heraussetzen.
So that's the story. It really pertains, like I say, to this Shabbat and to the story of the Rebbe accepting the leadership. What is the discourse that the Rebbe was discussing, and how is it relevant? I know some of the text is up here in Hebrew, but how is it relevant to what we've been discussing tonight? This is what we really need to get to. Firstly, interestingly, the previous Rebbe, in the last, I don't remember exactly how many years of his life, could barely speak. He had suffered a lot, especially in the Soviet Union, and his health was very weak in his 60s. And his speech was very difficult to hear and to understand. So he wasn't saying, talking publicly and saying the Hasidic teachings, but he would publish a booklet ahead of each holiday or special occasion of a Hasidic discourse or other writings for the people to study. So he actually published, for what turned out to be his day of his passing, such a booklet. Because that day is the same day as his grandmother's passing. So he observed that yahrzeit, and in honor of that yahrzeit, before that Shabbat, he had published a booklet of Hasidic teachings to be studied for that day. As it turned out, he passed on that day. So the Rebbe always saw those teachings and those pages of that booklet as a kind of will and testament of the previous Rebbe. That obviously as a tzaddik, he knew what was going on. And if he chose these teachings for the day that he actually passed on, this was his message. What is that teaching? This is the mimer, the discourse that begins with the words Basi Legani. So Basi Legani comes from the Song of Songs, Shir Hashirim of King Solomon, but this refers to our story. The Jews left Egypt and came to Mount Sinai, and God gave the Torah. And God says, Basi Legani, I have come to my garden. Which means I reached the destination. I wanted to be revealed in this world with the Jewish people, and I made it. But interestingly, the Medrash stops to point this out. God doesn't say, I came to a beautiful garden, I came to a beautiful place. He says, I come to my garden. Now, everybody wants to go to Florida because it's cold here. When you come to Florida, you don't say, I came to my Florida. You say, I left home and I came there. Why does God say, I came to my garden? Because God was coming back to the place where he was before. And this was really the point. God's presence was in our world originally in the creation of the world. Those remember from last course, the world was perfect in the beginning. God's presence was revealed. People weren't meant to die, all of that. When the people started to sin, it started to get messed up. But originally, God was in this place. And God is saying, when the Torah is given, I came back home, back to my garden, to my place, to where I really wanted to be, and I really used to be. Specifically, the Medrash goes through the history of it, because Adam and Eve were the first people, and they did the first sin. But then their son did another sin of murder. And through history, those generations, there was some more trouble. And each time, God's presence got further away. If you're familiar, in Jewish teachings, there are 7 heavens. Of course, there's only the sky as we see it. But 7 heavens means further and further away from being present in this world, until the point that God's presence is all the way at the 7th heaven, as far as it would get. But then thank God there's Abraham and Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They're turning the trend the other way and bringing God's presence closer, all the way to Moshe, which is already 7 generations from Abraham, and we're back from number 7 to our real world. This is the point of that midrash, and the discourse discusses what this means for us in our life to bring God's presence to this world. And the Rebbe points out that number 7. So in this evening that he was describing, the Rebbe quoted some of the teachings the previous Rebbe had published a year before for that day, and elaborated and explained it. And he points out that the previous Rebbe is saying in the 7th generation, we finished the job. 7th generation is when it came Abraham a little bit, down, all the way back to this world. So if you think about it in terms of the history of the Chabad Rebbes, the first Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, who lived in White Russia in the 1800s. Well, passed on in 1812, so late 1700s, early 19th century. He was the first. And the Rebbe would be the seventh Rebbe since then. So 7 generations in, we have to complete the job and bring God's presence to this world. So this doesn't surprise anyone. The Rebbe is always talking about changing this world and making it a place where Mashiach can come to, a better place, a more godly place, the kind of place that it was meant to be all along. But actually, interestingly, the Rebbe continued to discuss this discourse of the previous Rebbe throughout the years of his leadership. And the actual discourse has 20 chapters in its different sections. And the Rebbe started a custom, how every year, to focus on one chapter. So it took 20 years to actually elaborate for each chapter its own discourse of discussion of what could that mean and where we can elaborate and analyze that particular chapter. So by 1970, the Rebbe completed the cycle and began again. So we actually continue to do this, and each and every year focus on one chapter of this 20, which would put it at 11 for this year, because we're 71 years in, and study that chapter and what does it mean and what can we learn from it. And particularly study the discourses. The Rebbe talked about this chapter in 1961 and 1981. And that's what you have here is a section for the Rebbe talked about in 1981 about this chapter. We didn't get it translated in time, but obviously we'll try to explain it. This takes the idea that we're talking about to the next level. We talk about leaving Egypt, and not just leaving Egypt, but leaving the personal Egypt and the personal limitations. The personal Egypt and the personal limitations, we leave and we grow forward. We allow ourselves to expand and not feel that we're stuck where we were or we're stuck where life puts us or whatever that may be. But there's something that happens much deeper here. And the Rebbe goes through here is that the person who overcomes himself and he does beyond the way he thinks, beyond the way he feels, and beyond his revealed capabilities. So I think, for example, I'm stuck, or this is my limit. Or maybe I know I could do better, but I don't feel motivated, or I don't feel encouraged to actually go and do it. Or maybe I don't think I have it within me. In all the capabilities that I know about, the extent of my intellect, the extent of my talents, this is how far I can go. So we say, no, we have to overcome ourselves, and we can overcome our own nature to do more than the way it seems intellectually, emotionally, or based on our own capabilities. But not only that, the Rebbe continues, but to go against our own nature. Even though it can be a good nature, it can be a positive nature that God has given us. We should learn to push our own limits beyond our own nature. So we're not only talking about doing more, doing greater, doing better, but breaking free of the paradigm, breaking free of the box where we may have put ourselves and saying, that's our nature. It may be the nature God gave us, but we're still able to break out even of that. So the bottom line is that this is a person leaving Egypt, breaking free of his own limitations, and even transcending his own nature. Naturally, it's truly difficult. He's not making it up. Naturally, this person can achieve up to this point or up to that point, but the individual chooses to commit beyond his natural tendency and ability and actually discovers the deeper ability to achieve more. That's truly leaving Egypt, leaving the limitations. Remember, the Jews in Egypt at that time, they were born there. Their parents were born there. This is 210 years in. But nevertheless, they're able to break out of that. And an individual themselves say, I've always been in this position, that's the way I am, but we can transcend our own nature. But what does the Rebbe add after that? Because till that point we already know. Here the Rebbe says that when we break through of our own nature, God does the same. When we say we're not going to stop at the way we naturally feel we can do, but we're going to overcome our own nature, God does the same and breaks his own rules of nature and his own natural way and creates that exodus from Egypt. Because if you think about it, God created our world in a certain way with certain limitations. Water doesn't turn to blood. Rivers don't split. Why does it suddenly start happening? Because God chooses to transcend nature, to break the rules. Why? Because we do. Because we say we're going to break the rules. We're going to break our own rules, our own natural limitations. So God says, I will do the same. I will also break the rules on their behalf. This tells us something else about the Parsha, something that we should have put into the slideshow, but regardless, we can discuss. This is quoted in the Parsha. The mitzvah of the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering. So right between the last two plagues, really, and right before that section that we read, it says that at midnight, God appears in Egypt and kills the firstborn, and the Jews are freed. There's a whole long section. God is speaking to Moses and to Aaron and giving them a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? Set up a Jewish calendar, and this is going to be the month of the holiday of Pesach. And before Pesach, you're going to take a lamb and offer it as a sacrifice, a Passover lamb. What do you do with that lamb? Only a small part of that lamb was actually burnt as an offering, and the rest is supposed to be eaten in the family or in a group of people together and celebrate Pesach. That's the beginning of the Pesach Seder that we know, because God says to eat matzah too and maror, etc. This mitzvah was the mitzvah that took the Jewish people out of Egypt. In fact, the Medrash says that the Jews, they were stuck in Egypt and God wants to take them out. But as it's called, the heavenly court, the angels, they say, for what? They don't have any cash. They don't have any mitzvahs. They don't have nothing to show for themselves. So God says, I'm going to give them a mitzvah to do, so they have something with which they could leave Egypt. We have something to be worthy of leaving Egypt. I'm going to give them an opportunity to do a mitzvah, and they do it well, they can go. But that mitzvah is not just any mitzvah, but the mitzvah of the Passover offering. And if you remember the details how it worked that time, they were supposed to take the sheep 4 days before, bring it home, and prepare that way for the offering on the 14th of Nisan, the day before Pesach. Why? This was, it's something you're not supposed to try at home. But it was meant to make a statement in Egypt. Because the Egyptians, in today's society, people might be familiar with it. In India, which you have the concept of a holy cow, the Egyptians had holy sheep. They like the lambs more. So the holy sheep, the sheep were the idol. The sheep were the god, the sheep were the worship, they were holy, they were special.
The Egyptians, they did not eat the lamb.
They didn't eat the lamb,
But
exactly.
they just took the milk and cheese, right?
I would guess, but I don't have any information on it. But they didn't eat the lamb. And the Jews are now going to say, that sheep that you love, that you respect, that you consider holy, we're going to kill it. We're going to eat it. Obviously, this creates an explosion, and it did. And we're not going to get into all the details of that right now. But for the Jewish people, that took Mesiras Nefesh. That took self-sacrifice in a unique way. That took them saying, we're going to put ourselves on the line, and we're going to do whatever it takes to do what God says. Even though we know our neighborhood, and we know that they're not going to approve of this, and we're taking a risk, But God challenged them really to say, are you going to do the mitzvah? Are you going to do the mitzvah at personal risk? And they aced it. They did fulfill the mitzvah. And that really takes the Jewish people out of Egypt. So exactly as we're saying here, when a Jew says, I'm not going to look at the laws of nature, the nature of around me, or even my own fear, or my own restriction. I'm going to say, if this is the mitzvah, I'm going to do it at whatever the cost. Then God says, I'm going to do that too. I'm also going to break through the nature and take the Jewish people out of Egypt. And it's interesting that we always say that in the coming of Mashiach, God's presence will be revealed in this world completely in its infinite way. There's a problem with that. The problem, especially for those of you who have studied some Chassidus or Kabbalah, is that there's a reason for the restriction. There's a reason God's presence is hidden, what we call the tzimtzum. If God's infinite truth was always available, there would be no world as we know it. We can't have a finite world with finite people. It's kind of like that joke, traveling to the sun. It's too much heat. It's too much godly energy if there's no tzimtzum, if there's no restriction, if God is just revealed without anything holding anything back. So how will it be when the Moshiach comes? I understand we will have done our job and we're worthy and special and holy and wonderful, but how will that world survive? So a part of the explanation is that God is going to change the nature of it. In other words, yes, naturally or sensibly, logically, the infinite presence of God causes a finite world to evaporate, really, and to disappear. But unnaturally, anything can happen. And God is going to bring those two opposites together of a natural finite world and the infinite divine presence at that time of Mashiach. Why? Because we're also breaking the natural rules. Because we're saying we're not going to let anything stop us. We're not going to let our nature, the past 50, 60 years of our lives, to define us. We're going to say that today is not yesterday, and we're going to rise above it. God is going to do the same. On that note, there wasn't enough questions today, so we're getting to the end point early. But there's really another mitzvah that God gave the Jewish people in Egypt. And we say this when we do a bris, we do a circumcision. We say, and God says, you live by your blood. And we say this twice. There are two bloods that God gave the Jewish people before they left Egypt. The blood of the lamb of the Passover sacrifice and the blood of the bris milah of the circumcision, because most of the Jews had not been circumcised, and they circumcised themselves right before leaving Egypt. And with those, well, in today's world, without the temple, we actually avoid eating roasted lamb and even any roasted meat on that night. So we don't seem to be pretending to do the sacrifice without a temple. But if you cook the lamb, then it's okay. I don't know if you...
So, like, what do you mean roasting?
Roasting dry, without water, would be roasting it.
But what if you put it in the oven with the water?
Then it would be okay.
Wine inside that it's like...
If it's enough liquid,
So
about...
as long as there is enough liquid in there.
Yeah, it has to be not fried or baked,
So
but
it has to be
actually,
braised, basically.
yeah, at least like halfway there. Nothing needs to be a soup, but
Right.
it shouldn't be even chicken, even any meat. That night we don't fully roast it.
Should be more like stew, right?
Right.
But the second night?
That's all. Just the first night. So where we at? So in the bris we say those two mitzvahs because God gave the Jewish people those two bloods with which they were able to leave Egypt. Both two mitzvahs that were not easy, but they said we're going to transcend our nature and we're going to go out of Egypt. I'm bringing this up because yesterday there was a bris here. There was going to be one. I don't know exactly how old he is. He's a dentist. He's probably in his 50s. And he did his bris yesterday after 5 decades of a different nature. He said, my nature from yesterday is not going to define me today. I'm going to leave the Egypt and I'm going to do it. But what was most remarkable was an older individual. He's 82 years old. And my father had been talking to him for a while about doing the bris. And obviously he was hesitant. But yesterday, at the very last minute, he shows up, he says, I'm doing it too. And he said, nothing is going to stop a Jew. And you see, as God said, with the blood of the circumcision, with this kind of transcending your own limitation, we can go out of Egypt. And with God's help, with this kind of mitzvah, with this kind of self-sacrifice, some of you have shown, and we had some good examples of this yesterday, we're certainly ready to leave Egypt. In other words, for the coming of Mashiach today. I should just say, we're talking about the sacrifice and the challenge of it. I don't want to make it sound too difficult. Thank God, both of them, even the guy in his 80s, as soon as the procedure was done, came down on their own 2 feet, sat down, celebrated, they were feeling fine. So if you know somebody that needs it, it goes well. Nothing to worry about. But nevertheless, it takes courage, and that courage is exactly what we're talking about here. Break your own nature, and God will do the rest. That concludes our class. I should just say, as a little reminder, I'm holding the brochure here about the next course. This is where we watched the video the other time. The video just gives you 60 seconds. Here we talk a little bit about the details, what's in the course. So we're starting in 2 weeks. So February 1st for the in-person, and then that's when my camera goes and we split the virtual class because more people want to join. I'll do separately on Thursdays. So that's going to be February 4th. But the course, Journey of the Soul, discussing the afterlife, the life of the soul in Jewish tradition, really breaks down to these 6 topics we have here, discussing death itself, discussing what really happens, body and soul at that time. And then that would be 1. Number 2, we call taking leave. What happens at the moment of passing? What does it mean for the soul? What does it mean for the other people at that time? And then continuing the connection afterwards. Moving on to mourning. What does the mourning practices mean in Judaism? And what's happening to the soul at the same time that we're mourning in this world? From there, we go to talk about the other side of the fence. What's really happening in heaven with the soul? What's the mystery we all want to know? I was never there, thank God, but we can read about it and we will. And then two more classes, number 5 and number 6. 5 is also a hot topic, even though it's completely mystical, and that's reincarnation. Does the soul come back in another life, and what does that really mean? And some people say they remember their previous life. I can tell you that right now, that part can't be. But in Judaism, the soul does come back in another identity, and what does that actually mean, and how does that work? And finally, the last class will be a conclusion to discuss, okay, if we understand afterlife in Jewish tradition, then what about life itself? And what does it teach us for life itself and making the most of it? So that's going to be in 2 weeks from now. I should say that this course was run maybe 5 years ago, before I started teaching. They taught this course. It's very similar. I mean, it's been updated now, fixed up the mistakes and things like that, but the core ideas were the same. And it was the most popular course that the JLI, the Jewish Learning Institute, ever created, the most attendees. So it's something that a lot of people are wondering about. So it's a good time to join, as well as to invite a friend, whether they want to come in person or online, because it's something people are really interested to know and really asking about. I think they'll be really thankful for the invitation. And that concludes our class. And of course, I'm happy to take any further questions or discussion. Mark, any questions for you?
No, I'm good, thank you.
All right. Well,
Are we going to have a class on next Monday?
yes, we'll do next Monday similar to today, the portion of the week, etc. And then we will go.